year, tens of thousands of people are trafficked in the United States. In 2018, the Polaris Project, an organization that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, reported that they received 28,335 phone calls and 5,197 texts, not to mention web forms, web chats, and emails. Those 41,000 contacts to the hotline in 1 year alone represent just a fraction of the people victimized in the 21st century version of slavery here in the United States. In Illinois, there are several nonprofits, including Eden's Glory, a 2-year residential treatment program for adult women who are survivors of human trafficking. With me today, I have Ginger Coakley, the co-executive director, and Winda, a survivor of trafficking from the ages of 4 to 25, and who is now a peer support mentor at Eden's Glory.
Welcome to the Teacher's Classroom, the podcast that explores current topics in education with your host, Matt Weld.
This episode, by the very nature of the topic, does contain adult content. So if you have kiddos with you, you may want to hit the download button and save it for later. In this episode, we'll explore trafficking in general, get to know Winda's story a bit more, and also talk about how we can identify potential victims in school, as well as how we as schools can help prevent kids from future victimization. Stay tuned.
My name is Ginger Coakley, and I am a co-executive director for an organization called Eden's Glory, and that's an organization that serves women survivors of human trafficking, inviting them into the healing process. We offer residential services amongst a gamut of other opportunities for them to just restore from what has happened in their lives in regards to trafficking. And additionally, we have a high priority for prevention and education. So we want to do everything we can to prevent those in our community and in your communities from falling prey to being trafficked.
And I'm Winda M, and I'm a survivor of human trafficking.
Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being a part of this podcast.
It's great to be here.
Yes.
And we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how woefully ignorant I am about this whole topic. And I really am kind of embarrassed about that. So I'm hoping that this conversation can spark interest in the teacher community that is the audience here.
That's fantastic, Matt, and you're not alone. We encounter people all the time that say, "What's human trafficking?" and it's here. How could it be here? And so, yeah, it's you're definitely not alone.
I mean,
I was in your shoes 7 years ago.
Yeah, you hear about it on NCIS or whatever. I don't even really watch TV, so you hear about it on TV and in movies and things like that. And I think people maybe get a preconceived idea, or maybe they assimilate their definitions from the Hollywood version. So can you kind of tell us what it is in reality?
Sure. So I've got the federal definition for trafficking in front of me, so I'll read that, and then we'll just kind of go a little bit from there. And then maybe Winda can give her definition as well. So the federal definition for trafficking is the recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining of a person for some kind of service, whether it's compelled labor, commercial sex acts, and those have to come through the means of force, fraud, or coercion. So those are three big words for anyone who's wanting to learn about trafficking and understanding someone's story and identifying someone. Is there evidence of an individual being forced to doing something they don't want to do? Is there some kind of manipulation or fraudulent means by which those acts came about? And they can be by just the sweat labor of their physical bodies or through sexual exploitation. So those are that's a federal definition. If we're going to prosecute, if we're going to identify victims, if we're going to prosecute perpetrators, those force, fraud, and coercion has to be proved for anyone over the age of 18 in sex trafficking, and any age for a labor trafficking victim. But if there's a sexual act happening with a minor, it's automatically considered a trafficking situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was surprised to learn that so many people are trafficked for things other than sex.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was my go-to definition.
Absolutely. And in the United States, that certainly is the perception that the news and all the TV shows offer. Worldwide, the number that we can estimate, and multiple organizations try to do the research, but are estimating there's about 32 million slaves, persons trafficked in the world today. And worldwide, that number is 70% forced laborers. So persons working in the fields, harvesting a crop that becomes a product like T-shirts and coffee and chocolate. And clothing and chocolate and coffee are major industries where slave labor is at the root of the supply chain. So that's a worldwide balance of those numbers. 70% of that is forced labor. 30% of the 32 million is sex trafficking. But you get into the United States and the number actually kind of flips. So 60 or 70% of the number of persons in our country, which actually are United States citizens. Very seldom are they, relatively seldom is foreign nationals. So getting a little ahead of myself. So in the United States, there's far more sex trafficking victims than labor victims.
Okay. And so I was just trying to figure out why that may be true, but yeah. That's a really good question. Winda, do you have any insight on why in the United States the sex industry is so active?
Yes, it's because of porn, and people want to buy anything they see that they want it to be their own, so they think they can buy it.
Yeah, so we've really discovered it as we have journeyed with women that the traffickers and the Johns who are purchasing the sex really don't see the women and the victims as people or individuals. They really are a commodity. And so we are very much a consumer society, like Winda described.
Mm-hmm. Do you think part of it's because the sex trade is illegal? And so instead of having legal ways, it's just all black market and everybody's trafficked?
No, it really is about the human desire.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting across the world where countries have legalized prostitution. It actually greatly increases the reality of and traffickers more and more grabbing young, vulnerable people and bringing them in to sell them. So women aren't there of their own free will. They don't want to sell themselves. They don't want to be sold. They don't want to turn. I don't even know how many tricks a day that a lot of these women are forced to turn with the Johns, and so. Yeah, it's interesting that in the countries that have legalized prostitution, the amount of trafficked individuals being brought into those regions is much higher, actually.
Yeah. You mentioned that these people are forced into these positions. What do they use as the force?
Yeah, so many things. You want to speak to that, Winda?
Yes. My experience in it was different than other people's experience. Me, as a child, I was trained to please men. And as a young adult, it was my way of living. And it's anything like you don't have food, somebody step in and say they can provide food for you if you do this. You don't have clothes, they step in, and whatever it is that you're in need of, somebody will step in and try to give that to you.
So we were reading a manual that unfortunately can be even purchased on Amazon of how to be a pimp, how to recruit young girls, and it literally says go and find their vulnerability and see what it is that the girl wants. Does the girl want love? Does the girl want a house over their head? Does the girl want the latest technology, iPhone, or the greatest fashions? What does the girl want? And then provide that for her. And it's a really long, what they call grooming process. Some of the women we've served have even said like that they were groomed for a year, sometimes 2, before the reality turned for their boyfriend, quote unquote, became their pimp and said, if you love me, then you'll go and make money for me.
Or I've done all this for you. Now it's your turn.
Now you do this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you continue to want, whatever it is I've provided, this is what you'll have to do. So it's a slow grooming process of just being entrapped in that and believe that you're loved, and then it's hard to walk away because you're dependent on that person.
So being forced into labor or domestic situations or the sex trade, it sounds a lot like you're actually a slave, which, I thought we got rid of 100 and whatever years ago. Is it any different?
I would say it's different. One woman described herself as being hidden in plain sight. So her journey, she was in high school at the time when she was trafficked by her uncle, and her uncle would after school, her uncle would pick her up and go and sell her to his buddies, and then she'd get just a couple hours of sleep and then go to school. And so she was in the schools and trying to make it through, but her reality at school was different than her reality after school, and that was. So that's not like the slave trade of the 1850s. The slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, was more with chains, and this is more emotional and mental captivity than it is physical captivity.
Yeah. Well, either way, it's unfortunate. And so let's talk a little bit about that's like a broad definition. We just, as reference for the audience, we, meaning you guys and I, are down in kind of the St. Louis area. What can you say about the situation in our area or in Illinois in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first, I know a lot of listeners can be numbers people and they want numbers. Well, what's the research? What's the number? What's the reality? And the avenues of identifying the numbers is really difficult because even if someone's coming in for services, they're not going to identify as being trafficked. And so it takes the opportunity to get to know someone and hear their story to unpack and unravel what has happened to them in their lives. And so to get numbers of how many victims are in our area is really, really difficult. But what we have seen as we've gone around and done the trainings, as we have served women here in our area, there are different ways in which someone gets into a situation that makes them vulnerable. And so the question to ask in our communities is what is your poverty rate? What is the drug scene? What is the crime scene? What is happening with families, and how many foster kids are coming into your community or going out of your community to be fostered in another community? Because these are all vulnerabilities that are opportunities both for the traffickers see to prey on, but they are also opportunities for us to look about how to invest and engage in our communities. And so and move towards prevention avenues. So we've seen familial trafficking, which means that it's families that are trafficking their kids for like a trade of drugs for sex or something of that nature. Maybe it's housing for sex. That happens quite a bit, and then you could do a quick Google and say, I want sex with, and describe whatever kind of woman. You can pop up and almost like order her like a pizza. There's so much online that is happening. So it's all over our area in those ways. St. Louis has multiple interstates going through it and has hosted some major sports competitions. And those are all opportunities that bring trafficking to the
sports
area.
Competitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's an entertainment industry. So when there are sports competitions and people want to celebrate or put a salve on their wounds of a loss, it's all part of the commodity and consumerism and the entertainment industry. And so one organization that we work with goes into those major sports event cities and will do everything they can to rescue, because there's an influx. Traffickers will bring the women into the city for a couple of nights before and after a major sporting event, and then move them back out.
And so I've heard this before too, where St. Louis is particularly geographically ripe for the situation due to its interstate convergence. And I was talking to some police officers, and they even identified some particular exits where they find a lot of action more than usual. So, yeah. So is Illinois about on par with the rest of the U.S. as far as problems or concentration or anything like that?
Yeah, I guess I haven't done a major comparison of state to state. Winda, do you have any insight on that, given your experience here in the States?
What do you mean?
So Matt is asking if how Illinois' concentration of trafficking encounters compares to the rest of the United States. You have any insight on that?
Well, when I was in the life, I trafficked in so many different states. I barely remember what state that I was in. So it's almost everywhere it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So Winda, and you don't have to share if you don't want to, but so were you taken from place to place as opportunity arose or perceived opportunity arose?
It was both. I was in a place where the clients were coming to me, or I will go to the hotel and meet them. And there were times like I was physically moved from one state to another state to go meet with like big famous people to just do what they want.
Can I ask what the mode of force was in your situation? What were you promised in return for all this?
Oh, mine, it was mostly like if I didn't do something, they were going to shred my American passport. So I had to do the things that they were asking me to do before I lose my citizenship, because if I don't have a citizenship, they're gonna send me back to my country, which is not a good place for me to return.
And so what's the ending of your story? How did you come out of the trade?
Well, it takes a pregnancy to help me, because when I was working at one of the strip clubs, I found out I was pregnant. And when I talked to my pimp, and he told me he will give me the money to get rid of the pregnancy, and I'm not that type of person to just kill a child. So I said no. So he told me I can't be here unless there are clients that want to have sex with a pregnant person, which is happened a lot, but I didn't want to put myself and the baby in that situation. So I decided to leave, and I become homeless. And there were good people God put on my path that take me from one place to the other until I got to Eden's Glory and receiving my healing journey there.
Well, it's probably a journey you'll always be on, I imagine.
Yes.
Yes. And you now work to recognize other women and help them start the healing process?
Yes, I do. I'm a peer super specialist at Eden's Glory for the women that are coming fresh out of the trafficking.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they appreciate having someone who understands their situation.
Oh, yes, they do.
Yeah. And you probably have the ability to recognize.
Yes.
Maybe some of their pains, and also maybe even recognize people who are hidden in plain sight.
Yeah. Believe it or not, most of our stories are very, very similar to one another.
Well, I'm glad you found Eden's Glory, for sure.
I did too.
So let's talk a little bit about how we can get the schools involved in recognizing maybe current victims and also helping to prevent.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I know the teachers have so much on their plates, and so many trainings they've been through, and so even just curriculum that they have to present to the students and help them to learn and excel. And so like adding one more thing, to the repertoire, I understand is challenging to get it in and to invest energy in. And so I just want to say at the outset, for anybody who is sparked by this conversation wants to learn more, thank you. Thank you for wanting to put so much more energy into what you already pour out to your students. And this is an important topic, and not just for identifying a trafficking victim. Our heart is that trafficking is a symptom of a much deeper problem. And so just like we go to the doctor because we have a fever, the doctor's going to not just treat the fever, he's going to try and find out what the underlying causes are. And so we can't simply look and say, what is trafficking, and just treat the trafficking. There's underlying causes that bring someone to being in that circumstance. And so I think probably one avenue that I would love to see our schools do is to be more trauma informed as educators, and to understand what trauma is and how to identify it. And it's different. I'm sure some of you listening know what ACE scores are, about adverse childhood experiences, and seeing what ACEs happen in the lives of the students that you're teaching, and knowing how to respond through a trauma-informed lens is really important. And so things that make someone vulnerable to being trafficked is some things that we mentioned before with the poverty and the drugs and the broken families, having or being in the foster care system, just the estrangement from a safety net. Those are all symptoms and of the brokenness that is happening in their lives. And so, I think we'd love to come and train any teachers that want or districts that want to bring us in to teach educators. We can, trafficking's our jumping off platform, but we talk about so much more. And the trauma-informed training is something that we can do to bring to the schools as well. We do have opportunities to go a little bit of a deeper dive into what makes someone vulnerable and how to identify. And I think some of those identifiers come with just taking a good look at the students and saying, okay, if this student is falling asleep, why? What's happening in their nights that's not giving them the rest? And if someone if their demeanor changes because, once at one point in the beginning of the school year, they were pretty upbeat, happy, confident kid. And then something changes where they, maybe have the scared or they become nervous or submissive, kinds of demeanor or depressed demeanor, something changes in their emotion,
maybe someone who defers to adults seemingly more than most kids. Would that be a...
Yeah, I think so. Or feeling like they have to ask permission to speak, or afraid to speak because they don't want to get the answer or the story wrong or something like that. Just really seeing a fear response or a hypervigilance. Majority of the women I know that have come through, or not even just women, but anyone who's gone through traumatic situations, they just tend to be more hypervigilant, anxiety, legs twitching, hands moving, eyes darting. They're making sure that their back is to the wall so they can see all of the exits and entrances to the room. Those kinds of hypervigilant behaviors are evidence of someone with some kind of trauma in their story. So
that's great tips on how to maybe potentially recognize and, bring to the proper authorities and that kind of thing. What can schools do to perhaps girls whom you have had go through your program that are back in school? I assume that happens. And how can schools support girls who are trying to reassimilate?
You have any insight there, Winda? So our program is for adult women. So our perspective there is a little different, but we do work with them in re-engaging in society and that kind of thing. But as far as going back into schools, that's not particular to our program. But
okay, that's fair.
Do you have any insight though into any ideas of if a young person is kind of been through the recovery process, still healing and starting to go back to school? What tips, encouragement would you give to teachers, educators, school counselors?
I will say that there are some lines that you don't say, like especially if you know that this person is like a victim, like you don't say this stuff like I can't say it on there because it's bad, but people will like really say those things and make you feel uncomfortable, like
as in calling you names or referencing your past, or what should we avoid?
It's those two, but there are like some jokes people will make that are so inappropriate. I feel I'm not comfortable with these people when they are talking the way that they are talking, because they don't know my story, and I'm not going to share my story with them. So, and that's not going to make them stop anyway. But if I share the story with them, they're just going to be who they are.
Right.
Yeah. So I think one question that we found me helpful is, instead of saying what's wrong with you, because there will likely be some behavior issues, there will likely be some learning disabilities or strides that need to happen, rather than asking the question of like, what's wrong with you, but asking what happened to you, gets a lot more at the person, right. And not at the behavior. And then I think and I know that all schools have a sexual harassment policy and that kind of thing, but any kind of sexual innuendos are really hard to encounter, because a lot of times our survivor friends are saying, you don't even know what you're talking about.
For sure.
You don't even realize what you're saying.
And so let's talk about prevention. Like, how can we teach kids to not fall prey to the situation? Yeah. So I think it's important for educators to realize the national average for first-time exploitation for young girls, is between the ages of 12 and 14. And then the first exploitation for boys is actually ages 7 to 9. And so I think it's really important to start these conversations with our kids before those ages. And they're hard conversations to have because you don't want to scare the kids, but you want to protect them. And so I would say the first line is to actually protect them about their devices, how they interact with the internet, social media, all the different apps, how they interact with those is probably the first line of prevention as far as what we can safely talk about with every child. And then I think if there are vulnerabilities that have been identified in young families, I think, or in young kids, I think you can then get more specific, more one-on-one in
hoping to teach them maybe in some small groups or something, but teaching those students that fall into those vulnerable categories, doing some small group work with them about healthy relationships and about appropriate behaviors and interactions with anyone on the physical side and on the relational side. And just letting them know the tactics of recruiters and traffickers for those that are at even higher risk.
So I would think that would be a good. You identified some populations earlier in the program here: foster kids, maybe kids who are more transient, families moving in and out, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So maybe, and a lot of those kids are already identified in small groups with social workers. And so maybe, and I don't know, I'm not a social worker, so I don't know if these topics are already covered in those small groups. But it sounds like those would be great additions if they're not.
Yeah, definitely would make it a priority.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, both of you. How can people report suspected cases? I know as educators, we are mandated reporters to DCFS, but is there something else that we can do?
For sure. So there is a national human trafficking hotline that anybody can call it, whether you're reporting a tip of a potential victim that you suspect, or maybe it's a victim who's like, I want help, and they can call. Or if it is an educator, one of you guys that just wants to know more information. It's a 24/7 hotline. It is facilitated by the Polaris Project, which is a fantastic resource with tons of information online. Just Google Polaris Project. And that number, though, I have it plugged into my phone so that I can call it whenever I see something that is concerning. I often will keep my eyes out when I'm on the road, when I'm traveling, watching those truck stops, those suspicious exits. I'm just keeping an eye out. But anyways, that number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, that number is 1-888-37-888. It's 24/7. They speak like 200 and something languages. So there is lots of resource there when you call.
Great. And then your organization, Eden's Glory, how can people find you? Donate to your cause, that kind
absolutely.
of thing?
We are on Instagram as Eden's Glory, and we have a website that has tons of information about us. You can give online at that point. Often people will run little Facebook fundraisers for us as well, and so that's kind of fun. But we would definitely be grateful for the financial support, the prayer support. There are opportunities if you're in our area to volunteer as well.
So if anybody out there wants to run a little happy birthday Facebook fundraiser program,
yep,
you guys are on there.
Yep,
great.
We are. Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, and then we would be more than glad for you to just reach out to us and say, hey, I want you to come speak with our kids. We have age level appropriate materials, and we also can train any kind of community group or group of teachers. You have a small group at your church that you want to, just learn about this, something like that. We'll talk to anybody who invites us because this is so important to get the word out.
Absolutely. Well, Winda and Ginger, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and story.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
It's an important topic, and I'm hoping a lot of people learn more about this and become more aware. Because, like you said, you have it plugged into your phone and are on the lookout whenever you go to truck stops and exits. I am not. Like, it doesn't even occur to me to look.
Yeah.
So I need to do a better job of that. So thank you for educating me and everyone else. I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Teacher's Classroom podcast. Notes and resources can be found on our website, teachillinois.com/podcast. If you suspect human trafficking, please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. My name is Matt Weld, and I can be found on Twitter at Matthew Weld. This podcast is supported by the Regional Offices of Education in Area 5 of Illinois. If you are an Illinois educator who would like to earn credit for listening to this episode, check out teachillinois.org for details. Thank you.